Good. Well, welcome to you all. This session is on the throwaway culture, challenge of the throwaway culture, and some different perspectives here on that. My name is Greg Schleppenbach, and I am the Associate Director of the Office of Pro-Life Activities at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And in that capacity, I work primarily with federal pro-life policy on the issues of abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, biomedical research issues, cloning and stem cell, and human-animal chimeras, and all kinds of different things, genetic engineering and such. So those are the issues that I primarily focus on, and certainly very much in every one of those issues it has to do with the throwaway culture. But I'm going to take a little different direction here as the first person to lead off and be a little more general. I'm going to talk a little bit about the assisted suicide issue. Before I do that, I want to talk more 10,000 feet kind of thing, of looking at the roots and origins of the culture of death. As Pope St. John Paul II wrote an encyclical called The Gospel of Life. I referred to a little bit for those of you here in the morning panel. What he does in this document is really kind of do an analysis of the some of the, what he would say would be philosophical errors in our culture that lead to a distorted, impoverished understanding of the human person and of the dignity of human life and the obligations and responsibilities we have towards our neighbor and towards the dignity of life. In this encyclical, he of course talks about the origin of death in our culture, in our world, being the sin of Adam and Eve. It's when death entered the world for the first time, and this was a denial of God and His sovereignty. It was a decision by Adam and Eve to disobey God's command not to eat of that particular fruit in the middle of the garden, and this is where our faith would teach that death entered the world. That's when death first entered. And it was, again, this temptation to be like God. If you eat from that tree, you will be as knowledgeable and as powerful as God. And we can see that same temptation today in things like some of the especially in the area of biomedical research, end-of-life issues as well. In biomedical research, there was back when Dolly the sheep was cloned, it was the first time a mammal had been cloned, and there was a physicist who said he wanted to be the first person to clone a human being. And he was quoted in an article as saying, we're going to have almost as much knowledge and almost as much power as God. Cloning and the reprogramming of DNA is the first serious step in becoming one with God. So you can see that same origin in a number of ways throughout the history of man, of attacks and this temptation to be God and see life as something that, human life as something that we are arbiters of, that we own this life. We see it certainly in the end-of-life issues as well, in the assisted suicide movement, where they put out slogans like, my life, my death, my choice. Another example was Derek Humphrey, who was the founder of the Hemlock Society, and wrote basically a how-to manual on how to commit suicide. And at the beginning of the manual, it says, if you consider God the master of your faith, then read no further. And so again, it's a particular view of the human person and what our origin is. And again, I know that there are folks at this conference who probably have differing views of that. From a faith perspective, from biblical, from Christian perspective, this is the origin of death in the world. Death entered the world in a violent way when Cain killed his brother Abel. And we also can learn from that first way in which death entered the world in a violent way, and see the same sort of characteristics of the response of Cain to the question of where is your brother in every attack against human life since the beginning of man. And that is, I don't know where my brother is, a lie, and am I my brother's keeper? A failure to take responsibility for our neighbor. And so we can see those same characteristics in every attack against human life. Usually a lie. We see it at the beginning of life. It's a blob of tissue, it's a fetus, it's a product of conception. We don't know when life begins, on and on and on. These are all lies. We do know these things. At the end of life, the same sort of thing. This is death with dignity, or terms like that are purposely intended to really to deceive, to anesthetize, to treat these attacks against human life in ways that really are dehumanizing of the person. One of the terms you'll see in the cloning, for those who advocate cloning, is it's a product of SCNT, somatic subnuclear transfer. It's not an embryo, it's not a human being, it's a product of SCNT. All kinds of ways in which verbal engineering precedes social engineering. And you'll always see that. Anytime there's going to be some particular attack against fundamental principled beliefs of the dignity of humanity, they have to counter that by dehumanizing. In fact, there's a great book called Dehumanizing the Vulnerable When Word Games Take Lives by William Brennan, which I highly recommend, as it's well documented throughout history, at least in the major kinds of attacks against human life, how it starts with a change in the terminology from women to Jews to African Americans and every population, Slavic people and others who have been oppressed over the years, and he chronicles the terms that were used to dehumanize those who were then summarily killed and denied basic rights. So those are some of the origins of the culture of death, the roots of them. And John Paul II talks about some philosophical roots, and he starts with the perverse notion of freedom. That our culture tends to define freedom as the ability to do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. Total license. That's how we see it. Total autonomy, total license is how some tend to, in our culture, define freedom, as opposed to what we would argue is true, authentic freedom, and that is the ability to do what is right, what one ought to do, When this false notion of freedom, you can see the impact that has on how we view the human person. When life becomes about total autonomy, meaning I get to do whatever I want, and anything that gets in the way of my ability to do what I want is considered to be a burden, an obstacle, a problem that has to be dealt with. Whether it's the unborn child, the elderly, terminally ill person who needs our help, and our solution is abortion and it's assisted suicide, the impoverished person who needs our help. And we dismiss them with, this program or that program, as opposed to personally helping that person in need, our neighbor in need. There's so many ways in which this happens. This autonomy gets in the way. It tends to see human beings, again, not as opportunities to demonstrate love, but rather as obstacles to my freedom. Relativism is another philosophical problem that Pope John Paul talked about in this document, and this notion that there's no absolute truth, that everything is relative, including when life begins or what our obligations are to others. There was a quote from the Supreme Court case Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, when the Supreme Court looked at some Pennsylvania laws like informed consent and parental consent, spousal consent, and things like that, but they also revisited Roe, whether or not to overturn Roe, and they ultimately, of course, reaffirmed Roe and affirmed some of the provisions in the law of Pennsylvania, also struck some down. And one of the things that was quoted, that the Supreme Court majority opinion said, is at the root or at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. That's relativism. So, and the problem, of course, with that is if there is no objective reality, if there's no objective truth, and particularly in the area of what a human person is and what our obligations are to human beings and human rights, then what's to keep me from saying, well, if this liberty means the ability to define my own concept of existence and of meaning and the universe and the mystery of human life, what if my concept doesn't recognize that you exist or that you have inherent rights? This is the intrinsic problem with relativism. Materialism as well. A materialistic culture where our pursuit is the pursuit of goods and things, where much of how we define quality of life is how much we have. You can see again how, like with radical individualism and a false notion of freedom, that things that or people who get in the way of my pursuit of material possessions becomes a problem. I don't want to have to care for you. let's have abortion, or let's have these other things. You were the one who was irresponsible and got pregnant. Don't make me care for that child. These kind of things, you can begin to see how these errors color or discolor how we view the human person and how we view our responsibilities towards our neighbor. And again, tend to cause people to see others in need as problems to be fixed or gotten rid of, as opposed to opportunities for us to demonstrate sacrificial love by really reaching out and sacrificing to help those individuals in need. But John Paul II went beyond that to talk about what he said was the real heart of the tragedy. And he said, in seeking the deepest roots of the struggle between the culture of life and the culture of death, we can't restrict ourselves to the perverse idea of freedom. We have to go to the heart of the tragedy being experienced by modern man, the eclipse of the sense of God and of man, typical of a social and cultural climate dominated by secularism. And again, I know this challenges individuals who don't believe in God, but the idea is that if we believe that God is our creator, and that our existence, our dignity and value come from the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God, well then if you don't know God, you're not going to fully appreciate the value of the creature he made in his image and likeness. And if you don't value or understand the dignity, the origin of the creature made in his image and likeness, you're more likely to violate the dignity of that creature made in his image and likeness. And John Paul II would say that leads to a sad, vicious circle. When the sense of God is lost, there's also a tendency to lose the sense of man, of his dignity, of his life. In turn, the systematic violation of the moral law, especially in the serious matter of respect for human life and its dignity, produces a kind of progressive darkening of the capacity to discern God's living and saving presence. So, again, this for some people would be a very challenging sort of analysis of our culture's problems, but for people who do believe in God, for people who are professors of Christianity, certainly, I hope this resonates. Because this notion that if we don't fully know who God is, we're not going to fully appreciate the value of the creature made in his image and likeness. It's a PowerPoint presentation I normally give, and I usually at this point show this picture. You probably can't really see it, but it's a very modern kind of picture of what look like a whole bunch of little balls, but you can actually sort of see a face in it. It's a very modern kind of painting, and I just ask people, how many of you like this painting? Most people don't. It's just not their style of art. And I say, well, I don't either, and it's not something that I would put on my wall. I wouldn't, if somebody gave it to me, I'd probably sell it at a garage sale or something. And if I would do that, I would make a really big mistake, because this painting was done by Salvador Dali, and it's worth a lot of money. And so the point being that if you don't know who the artist is, or the creator, you can't fully appreciate the value of the creation. And the same thing with God. While it may not always be true, again, those of our brothers and sisters here who are atheists or don't believe in God, they obviously have something in their heart that says human life is valuable, and they're defending it, and that's a good thing. But generally speaking, most people, if they don't know who God is, they're not going to fully appreciate the value of human life made in his image and likeness. So one of the keep track of time, I wanted to mention just a little bit about this issue that we're faced with assisted suicide. This has been an issue that's been around for a long time. Oregon first legalized assisted suicide in the mid-90s. There was great concern that when that first state legalized assisted suicide, that very soon after we would see state after state after state. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Certainly initially it was many years, I think 8 years before Washington State became the next state to legalize assisted suicide. And then it was some time before Vermont became the next state to do so. And then a very pivotal event happened in 2014, and that is Brittany Menard. Many of you might know about Brittany Menard. Became kind of a social media sensation. Young, beautiful, attractive woman who got glioblastoma, a very lethal form of brain cancer, and announced right away that she wanted to be able to commit assisted suicide to end her life. She lived in California, couldn't do it, hadn't been legalized in California, and moved up to Oregon, and ultimately, before she died, became a spokesperson for Compassionate Choices, the prime organization that advocates for the legalization, of assisted suicide. and again, really propelled the assisted suicide movement. And as a result of that, it was a big reason why California then ended up legalizing it. Colorado last year through ballot initiative, and the District of Columbia through their city council last year as well. So, and in this year, in 2017, 29 states saw legislation introduced to legalize assisted suicide. Thankfully, none of them have done so. But there's definitely renewed energy in the assisted suicide movement. And so one of the things that we're doing to, and I should mention that the assisted suicide groups, Compassion Choices primarily is one of the big ones. They are heavily funded by George Soros and have a $20 million budget. Have, I understand, something like 12 to 15 full-time paid people just raising money to do this work. So they are a formidable force, and it's going to be a real challenge. It's going to be a real challenge to keep these dominoes from continuing to fall state by state. But thankfully, there's been these coalitions. For those of you who were in the meeting, in the panel this morning, heard me talk a little bit about building these coalitions in fighting assisted suicide. Because unlike the abortion issue, which has unfortunately become more partisan, the assisted suicide issue has not as much become partisan. And at the state level, there are a lot of people on the left end of the political spectrum, the Democrats, who have taken strong positions against the legalization of assisted suicide, and that's fantastic, because largely they recognize that the people who are most likely to be hurt and disaffected by assisted suicide are the poor and the marginalized, who have least the access to good health care, are going to be more likely to be where this is going to be the only choice. And we've actually seen examples of that in the states that have legalized it, where individuals with life-threatening illnesses have been denied life-saving treatment and been offered assisted suicide drugs instead. And this is only going to get worse, especially where healthcare is at and been driven largely by economics. And those who have the least access to good, affordable health care are the ones who are going to be most vulnerable to being denied care and offered assisted suicide as well. So we've been able to keep the Democrats and the left to recognize that this is an injustice that should be opposed. And we're working very hard to keep it that way. And the disability rights community, that's, again, very strongly affected. They see how their lives are dismissed by assisted suicide proponents, that most people who are have terminal illness or serious illness have some form of disability as well. In every other area where somebody would consider suicide, we're going to work to prevent that. But in this one area, when somebody is in a very vulnerable state and with a terminal illness, we're basically saying to that person standing on the bridge, go ahead and jump. Your life is not worth saving. Your life is not worth supporting and helping. Go ahead and jump. And so it's important that we continue to do that and that we message it the right way. There's been a lot of talk about staying away from the religious arguments against abortion and various attacks against human life. And this is one of the areas where we absolutely agree. Because compassion and choice is very much makes, especially the Catholic Church, but religion in general, the enemy. And they want to say that the only people who are really opposed to assisted suicide is the Catholic Church and religious groups. And which is simply not true. And that's why we put the disability groups in the medical community and the minority community and others out front and saying, wait a minute, no, there are lots of other people and Democrats who are saying, no, this is not a partisan issue, it's not a religious issue, it's a basic issue of justice and human rights.
My name is Steve Bozza, and among other things that I do, I'm a professor of biomedical ethics for Catholic Distance University, and spent a good bit of my time working with bioethics and beginning of life issues mostly, but also end of life. And so I think Greg gave us a good, or gave me a good entry into a very specific case, and that's the Charlie Gard case. So what I want to do is just kind of summarize what was going on with him. He had a very, very rare genetic disease called mitochondrial DNA depletion syndrome, and he was terminal. He suffered from severe seizures, brain disorder, other debilitating symptoms. He couldn't walk, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't eat on his own. The Charlie Gard case brings us to two questions that I think really need to be examined. One question is, is it legitimate for us to remove life support from this individual with this type of case? And the second question that it begs is, who makes that decision? So I'd like to talk a little bit about the bioethical framework for persons in that type of state to determine whether or not we are justified in removing life support from a loved one, or from most likely a loved one, because you're in this state, you can make a decision by yourself. So the first question we have to determine is whether this particular person, in Charlie's case, was his treatment proportionate or disproportionate to his condition? Now, there are other ways that we can determine that, ordinary and extraordinary care. But proportionate and disproportionate, I think, works a little better because it's a little more precise. And the key phrase that we need to examine in any of these cases is, does this particular treatment offer reasonable hope of benefit? Reasonable hope of benefit. Now, you're going to find ethicists out there that try to fudge this particular statement to say reasonable hope of recovery. Well, if you hear that from anyone, they're wrong, and you can tell them they're wrong, and if they don't believe you, tell them to call me, and I'll tell them they're wrong. It's reasonable hope of benefit, which means that there's going to be something that happens to this person that's going to give him some nourishment, going to give him some care, going to give him some relief of the symptoms or what have you. That's not going to kill him, but at least it benefits him in some way. In Charlie's case, we're not seeing that evident. We're not seeing that that anything that they do or could have done would have benefited him in a way that's not going to stop the progression of death. Now, this is what we call in medicine medical futility. You can only determine futility if their case is disproportionate, or their treatment is disproportionate to what they have. So let's take it away from Charlie's vantage point yet and take a look at a person now who is in kidney dialysis, and he's been in dialysis for many, many, many years. It's becoming very, very burdensome for him, and he wants to be taken off the dialysis. So the question is, well, what other conditions do you have? Do you have maybe another lethal condition like cancer, or maybe heart disease, or what have you? Is this becoming very, very burdensome for you? Burdens can be very subjective, but you could look at burdens as being something that's very expensive. Maybe burdens could be something that's very painful. Maybe burdens are something that's very repugnant to you. For instance, a person has cancer in the jaw, and the physician wants to go in and remove the mantle. Well, this is very disfiguring, but that would be life-saving. And that prospect is so repugnant to this person that they can't possibly see them live this way. And so now these things start to present some burdens that we have to take into account. So in Charlie's case, the burdens weren't there for him not to receive this experimental treatment. His parents were wealthy, they could do what they want. It didn't seem to me, although I may be missing something, it didn't seem to me that it would be very painful for him. But if it was painful, now that's another issue that we have to deal with. But we don't know that answer, and we can't speculate. But at the same time, if the parents wanted to do this disproportionate or experimental care, they're well within their moral rights to do it. And conversely, if they didn't want to do anything experimental with him, they were in their rights to say, no, just let him die. Just let him die. Okay. So the issue wasn't necessarily whether he should have been taken off life support or whether he should have been kept on it. Because reasonable people could look at this and say, well, look, this guy's is death is coming. There's nothing that you can do to stop it. They would have been in their rights to say, yeah, let's just say no and let him die. There's a principle in personalist bioethics that is I think, a very good form of bioethical inquiry that says life is a fundamental value, but not an absolute one. Life is a fundamental value, but not an absolute one. It's because it's not life at all costs. We can allow people to die. We can never cause persons to die, but we can allow death to take its place. So in Charlie's case, you know, at least my analysis of it, if the parents would have said, you know, just let him die, I think that would have been, they would have been a good moral ground. However, the second question now becomes all important. Who makes this decision? Is it the parents? Is it the hospital? Is it the state? Well, let's look at some framework or foundations in bioethics that can answer this question to you. There's a principle that we have called subsidiarity. And what subsidiarity is, and what it basically says is that the decisions for a person's health care must be made by the free and competent individual. When that person is not free and competent anymore, then it goes to what we know in medicine, and you guys have heard this all along, the next of kin. Well, who's the next of kin? It's the family. The family has that right to make that decision. And then if the family's not around, then we can bring it to the courts. But part of this whole principle of subsidiarity is when that lower level, when the family is found, the courts back off. When the person becomes free and competent, the next of kin backs off. Because it always goes down to the lowest level. And what we found here is a deep and abiding dismissal of that age-old principle of subsidiarity. The courts had no right to make this decision. None. And there lies the problem. Not whether he should have been taken off the life support. Because reasonable people will agree, the guy's dying. Just let him go home to God. Or just let him have peace. Okay? So that wasn't the issue. The issue was who makes that decision. Now, what's the danger for all of us? Well, the danger for all of us is the march towards socialized medicine. Now, we've been hearing a lot about the Affordable Care Act, we've been hearing about repeals, no repeals, this, that, and the other thing. The bottom line is, the individual person is the one who is responsible for whatever health care that they make. If we go to a system where we have government-controlled medicine, well, guess what? There's X amount of dollars in this federal budget for medicine. When those X amount of dollars are depleted, guess what? You don't get the care. You don't get the care. If we wind up with this utilitarian ethic of, and we do this, you know, we use this in triage. If there's a bomb, a nuclear bomb in the city of Philadelphia that detonates, there's a number of hospitals within that area. There's about 3 of them that I know right off the top of my head. They're not going to take those people who are really, really bad off. In the system of triage, what do? They take the person who could be helped, fixed, and pushed aside. Go back out and do your thing. Help, fixed, and do your thing. They don't necessarily use those resources in a situation like that for people who are massively injured. Because you're not going to be able to take care of all those people in that type of situation. And that's, triage is legitimate. But we will live in a continual system of triage if we have other people outside the individual taking care of our medicine. Well, look, you know, I'm sorry, Steve, you're 62, and you know, you need a kidney, but guess what? We don't have that many kidneys around, and this 25-year-old is probably going to have a better life than you. So you're not going to get that treatment. The 25-year-old is going to get the treatment. You think that's not going to happen? It will. Because if you have a small pot of money that has to deal with everyone's health care, guess what? Utilitarianism will be alive and kicking. So Charlie Gard teaches us a lot of things. He teaches us, and you know what? You know, God in his infinite wisdom uses the adverse to teach us something very profound. And what is very profound is not only the idea that the issue was his parents should have been making this decision, but watch out, people. Don't allow yourself to get sucked into a utilitarian method of providing health care to the population. And as Greg said, there's a lot of euphemism going on out there. And we have to be able to break through that euphemism to see what the truth is. The other thing I think is alive and well is that paternalism is still very much existent in medicine. Now, for those of you who are a little bit younger than me, I can remember when I was a kid and my parents' and grandparents' time, you know, doctor said it all, doctor was right. You know, the doctor said we have to do this, well then we do that. I can tell you situations in my own life where we've had family members when the doctor said, oh, there's nothing wrong with that lump in your breast. Yeah, just ignore it, it'll be fine, we'll just keep the tabs on it. Well, paternalism. Doctor said it, it's got to be right. No, it's not right. And so we've taken strides over the years to break away from that paternalistic attitude. But guess what? It's alive and kicking. Who made that decision that Charlie Gard had to die? Not parents. It was the medical profession that convinced the courts. There's another avenue of paternalism that we have to be very, very careful of. And that's what we call the physician-authorized life-saving treatment orders, called POST. There's a form out there now that we can give that says that we give the power to the physician to make these life-determining situations for ourselves. Stay away from POST orders. You don't know the values of that doctor, and you may know, but maybe you don't. You don't know what kind of monetary incentives this particular hospital or doctor has to authorize something for you or not to authorize something for you. Be on your guard. I know this sounds like an ominous message, and I don't mean it to be ominous, but we're living in very, very difficult times and very dangerous times. And we have to be aware of the things that Greg was talking about and personalize it and bring it down to the next level. This is the next level. Charlie Gard's the next level. And unless we are aware of the way we could get trapped into these things, we will get trapped into these things. I can remember when my mother was dying, my parents, my father and my brothers had kind of looked to me for guidance on some of the medical issues. My father would always tell the attending physician, call my son. So I had a couple conversations with the guy. He was a wonderful doctor, and I thought he was just a wonderful guy. He says, you know, Steve, you guys are going to have to start making some decisions. And so my question to him was, is she in a state of futility? And he said, well, we can make a case for that. I don't think he knew who he was talking to. And I said, well, doctor, you're not making a case for anything. I want to know clinically, yes or no. And so at the time, he said, no, there are other things that we can do. I said, well, let's do those things. Because she wasn't at that point of futility. But there comes a time in a person's life where nothing that you can do is going to change or stop that march to death. And if you're in a case of futility, then morally you're not obligated to continue to do these treatments. You're not. And so But the key to that is like the key to anything else. You have to know what to ask a physician and not be afraid to do that. So I want to kind of pass it on to Maureen here, and then we can talk a little more afterward.
May we ask questions while it's fresh, or?
Just real quickly, because I don't want to interrupt our time.
I agree with you that utilitarianism is a big problem. But I think the Charlie Gard case isn't so much against socialized medicine, but really utilitarianism, really totalitarianism. For example, we have socialized fire departments, socialized police departments, socialized sewer, transportation, sanitation, water, and it doesn't seem to be a big problem. Everyone's more or less, it's working well. And the fear is with socialized medicine that people will be boxed out for economic reasons. But isn't that why we need something? Isn't that the crisis we're in, that people are being boxed out for economic reasons?
Well, I would agree with you.
What I'm saying is, ideally, we could have a completely socialized medicine system, but if we thought the right way, it wouldn't be a problem. So it's not really socialized medicine, it's this utilitarian, totalitarian, the state will decide what's best for you. And
I agree with that. I'm just very, very cautious when medicine's not cheap. I mean, it's not cheap. It's cheaper to run a fire department, it's cheaper to run a police department, it's cheaper to run all those things. Medicine is not cheap. And because it consumes a lot of financial resources, we're going to run into budgetary reasons for not providing life-saving treatments to this person or that person. Now you're right. It's the attitude. It's the cultural attitude. But I got to tell you, more and more, I see our cultural attitudes we're so far behind you. We are so far. It astounds me to hear people say, and honestly believe what they say about human life, about abortion, about all these other important issues. To think that these guys are going to be responsible for my medical care is very, very frightening. And so, it's the chicken or the egg. What comes first? In some regard, how do you change the social attitude of a culture that is living in the world? That's the big problem. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's the big problem.
Could I just kind of say, the thing you said about socialized medicine, I don't understand it because privatizing medicine and having medicine for profit, that you're applying a critique of socialized medicine, but your argument actually applies to privatized medicine, for profit. And for profit is, all materialism, consumerism. It's not just benefiting the patient, it's benefiting,
The
the
corporation.
CEOs, the insurance companies, and so I completely disagree with what you're saying.
Well, that's
I
fine.
mean, because it's,
Let's
but I understand,
Yeah.
it gets klutzy when you get very big government things, but it's certainly not any less ethical than for profit, for me,
Yeah.
for my.
I would like to
Yeah.
pick up on that because I think we're saying pretty much the same thing. Let's bring more into the
Yeah.
conversation and we'll come back.
Thank you, Greg and Steve, and I'm very honored I get to tell a story of my brother's life, and I know perhaps it's a little bit anecdotal, but I think it serves to echo a lot of the points that you both brought up, and And it's a bit of a pushback also against this throwaway culture about the utilitarianism you were bringing up. But first of all, my name is Maureen Swinger. I'm an editor at Plough Publishing House. We have a booth downstairs, and I hope a few of you have picked up our Plough Quarterly magazine. Steve, can I just steal these two from your These are complimentary for you here at the conference, and this one is tailor-made for this conference. It's a back issue, and this is a more recent one which has a longer version of my brother's story, which I'd like to tell today. Thank you, Steve. So the story of my brother's life, my brother Dwayne was born healthy, as far as anyone knew, in 1980. But when he was 3 months old, he was attacked by his first grand mal seizure, very violent, 2-minute-long seizure that really damaged his brain, and countless more were to follow after that. And he was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, a very rare form of epilepsy. And the seizures were so brutal and brain damaging that the doctors pretty much told us, well, if he can live through a year, you're lucky. We started taking lots of photos and trying to document this precious year that we were going to have with our brother. Well, that year stretched out into 31 and a half. And often when I've told people about this brother of mine, I've seen questions in their faces, and often as not, they'll just come right out and ask me, quite honestly, why was he even born? Why put him through such needless suffering? Why do you dedicate your family's time and energy to a hopeless case? Why spend all that money? And at first I was quite floored by this kind of a question because it was so artlessly asked. It was so, no offense meant, and it was strange to me. I didn't know how to put words to it. I was quite tongue-tied in answering. It began to dawn on me how relentlessly this worldview has just overtaken our culture without people perhaps being aware of the direction this kind of question is leading us. And yet these same utilitarian principles are invoked in debates about euthanasia, about abortion, all the time, and questions of right and wrong. And in trying to understand how someone could pose such questions, I tried to do a little bit of homework, and I picked up this textbook. You may be familiar with Peter Singer, professor of bioethics at Princeton University. In his textbook, Practical Ethics has been a staple in ethics classrooms for 20 years, so I was going to give myself a little crash course in utilitarianism. And in his view of utilitarianism, which in many ways is just a very articulate way of expressing where our culture is going, to act ethically means to seek to maximize a given benefit, the satisfaction of people's desires, which would be that benefit, which people is an open question. And this, in Singer's view, also means that we must seek to minimize the suffering of people who are unable to express these preferences, if necessary through terminating their lives before or after birth. And these are people such as Dwayne. So I hadn't got past chapter 7, Taking Life, Humans, before I was in a distinctly unchristian frame of mind. Well, put it bluntly, I was seeing red. And I realized that I'd fallen somewhat into this trap of utilitarian philosophy that kindly makes allowances for families of people with severe disabilities. In a paternalistic way, our concerns are designated as merely love, not logic, just love. And so, of course, we're emotionally attached to a specific person because we know them and we care for them through their life, but we're given to understand that if we hadn't formed these personal attachments, we would be more logically inclined to see this reason behind a recommended abortion or euthanasia for, as he terms it, non-rational, non-self-conscious beings such as Dwayne. So I realize that many families don't have the ammunition to argue with that sort of premise. If love doesn't count, if the sacredness of life doesn't count, what other arguments can you use from your heart? But in my family, we had a case study. We didn't set out to have a case study, but we were just living at the time. But we ended up with a big ring binder full of data and 72 living witnesses that are ready to testify. And tell more on that a little bit later. But to go backwards a little bit, in 1980, this whole Save the Children from Existing movement hadn't quite reached a backwoods corner of Pennsylvania where my family lived. And even if it had, I know what my parents would have said. They didn't know there was anything catastrophically wrong with Dwayne before he was born, but they would have said he's our son. So, that question was taken out of our hands by their belief and their respect for all life, and nobody ever could figure out how much he could understand. The neurologist once gave him an aptitude test. I think he was supposed to tell the difference between a red square and a yellow triangle, and he showed no interest whatsoever in indicating a difference. And the test came back that he had the cognizance or cognition of a 3-month-old. This is when he was 12 or 13, and our family just left. I mean, this is a very vibrant individual here who, because of his seizure activity, it was interrupting his situational awareness and his long-term memory. But nobody could ever take a snapshot neurological test and tell us where this boy was. So then I was asking myself, well, can editors of ethics textbooks do any better? I mean, for many in this utilitarian camp, not all members of the human species are persons per se. They argue that personhood requires self-awareness and the ability to conceive of future goals in life and plans, and to experience oneself as having interests. Well, I don't know if that could have described my brother at all. But how do you find out if someone has interests? And perhaps one of the greatest challenges to apply to ethics is just the lack of practical chances to apply them, right? I mean, how many professors of ethics spend time with the people who arguably shouldn't be around to spend time with? So I'm talking about encounters that last hours, maybe years, not these encounters where you pass someone in a subway or you glance over in a restaurant and then quickly away. You know, the time of a tested getting to know somebody who's very different from yourself. And so to someone who's just glancing and looking away, this was my brother. He was a very long, lanky person in a very high support wheelchair. He just would often gaze vacantly at the ceiling. He had a contracted wrist. He often drooled. But if you talk to anyone who spent any amount of time with him, that's not how they describe him at all. It wasn't essential to who he was, and that's part of my bone-deep conviction that Singer is wrong about people who are considered persons or beings or whatever his terminology is. My experience with Wayne was definitely that he was a who. He was a somebody who, even in Singer's terms, had interests, and he had a good purpose for what he was made. And so, who was this someone? Well, he had a very impish grin. He had this mischievous sideways glance that was kind of like mischief is going down. And he had a wonderful personality, and you could discover that very easily if he wasn't in this post-seizure daze. And he just derived enormous satisfaction over his day, just the daily course of events. If you adjusted his seat in the wheelchair, you got a big grin. If kids came up and were fiddling with the bolts on his wheelchair, he was in giggles, you know, for any length of time. And if there was a fireworks show, he would just laugh until he choked, and we'd all be sitting there saying, "Breathe, Dee, breathe," and then the next one would go off and he'd just be gone again. People would move over to join us at the fireworks show because, you know, double the joy. Here's somebody who really knows how to appreciate the appreciatables. And if fireworks aren't handy, sparklers are just as great. Okay, so this is Dwayne, and he also knew how to get mad. So if church or lunch went on for a bit too long, there would be this enormous "get me out of here" roar, and woe betide if you didn't get him right out of there. So there were 5 of us siblings, and Dwayne was right in the middle, and we were very proud of him, and we sort of glared at anybody that looked strangely at him, and we bristled, and we just had to take our own time to understand that he would get to know people at his own time and his own speed. We didn't have to defend him or protect him. But we all sure prayed every night when we were little that God would do a miraculous miracle and that he'd run out of his room the next morning hale and whole, and that never happened. And in each of our lives we've had to come to that point where Dee is here, he's here as he is for a reason, and we don't know what that reason is, but time for us to get going and appreciate and learn about that. And that discovery didn't make things too much easier for our family. We can scan back over these 31 wonderful years, but then if you slow down the frames, there's lonelier scenes coming into view. There's the races to the hospital and all the sleepless nights, and just the fact that you are always going to be different and always going to be looked at in public. And yet at the same time, we can't complain because we were among one of the most supportive families probably ever to have a child with disabilities. We ended up, my parents had joined the Bruderhof church communities when they were young people, and if you're not familiar, it's a movement of church communities that live together in villages, and they share all their income and their property in common, and we base our faith on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and on the book of Acts 2 and 4, where it describes that all the believers are of one mind and they share all their goods in common and nobody was rich or poor. And we try and extend that to mean everybody's cared for, the elderly, the cancer patients, the people with disabilities. So what better place could Dwayne have possibly arrived at? And yet, it still wasn't that tidy, happily ever after to a story, right? Because every church community has to grow in its understanding of the needs of each individual. Every family, every person has to do that. And so when he was little, we as a family managed all his home care, and he went to the child care center on the Bruderhof premises, and they wove him into their peer group program, which was great. But then when he got to be 12, 13, he was really tall, and if he had a seizure while someone was lifting him out of his wheelchair, he could throw himself and his caregiver to the ground. And at that point, the Bruderhof we were on felt, this is maybe beyond us. We don't want him to be hurt. We don't want his caregiver to be hurt. Perhaps the best place for him is a school for special needs. And he went to a fantastic school for several years, maybe till he was 18 or so. And meanwhile, at home, our family developed into a really capable group of nursing aides and cooks and errand runners, and we were all very proud to manage what it took to manage his home care. But we also were putting a brave front on. We were not telling anybody about the crazy nights. My brother Evan was a great first responder. He slept in Dwayne's room, and he could turn a deaf ear, I don't know how, to the very deafening happy noises going on all night, but he woke up as soon as he heard like the grunting sound of a grand mal seizure starting up, and he would run for my dad. And so this was our first 18 years coping with Dwayne, and it was all right. I mean, I didn't know how our family would have become the fighting unit it became without being tested. Here we were all very opinionated individuals, had our own ideas about which way to go and what to do when, and this really pulled us together as a team like nothing else possibly could have. At the same time, he wasn't quite where he could be. There was something missing in this picture. And then a new pastor came to join our community in upstate New York from England. He was Richard Scott, very short, very British, very funny, and very perceptive. And he could look Dwayne right in the eye pretty much from wheelchair level. And Dwayne looked back, and they sort of got each other's number. And Richard was wondering, are we really doing, by Dwayne, what we could be doing? Are we missing something in the gospel message? If he's going off to school every day, here's a teacher without students, here's a missionary without a mission field, and on the other hand, here's a whole bunch of young men, his peers, a little bit older, who are growing up in this great community where they hear about service, and they hear about care for the earth and for humanity, and yet they don't get a lot of chances to put that into practice. Then they're into their music and their sports, which is great, and into their career ambitions, which is wonderful, but when is life gonna become real? Before they're a dad. And so, sorry, I'm just gonna
Apologize.
No problem. So these concerns came to a head. We had a church community meeting one evening where we were reading through our founder, Eberhard Arnold's words, an essay he'd written back in 1920, World War I, post-World War I Germany, and the devastation of the veterans coming back from this failed war, and with already some of the pre-Nazi sentiments building in a somewhat scary and unstable time. And his essays, I'd like to just read it because it really pinpointed what was going on in our lives at this point. And he wrote, again and again, what it amounts to is a clash between two opposing goals. One goal is to seek the person of high position, the great person, the spiritual person, the clever person, the person who, because of his natural talents, represents a high peak, as it were, in the mountain range of humanity. The other goal is to seek the lowly people, the minorities, the disabled, the prisoners, the valleys of the lowly between the heights of the great. The first goal aims to exalt the individual by virtue of his natural gifts to a state approaching the divine. In the end, he is made a God. The other goal seeks the wonder and mystery of God becoming man, God seeking the lowest place among us. And that was just a watershed for our family. My dad, he jumped up and he just ran out of the meeting. He was in tears. Somehow it summarized for him everything that he'd been battling with in his heart about the message of Dwayne's life. He's not a man of many words. He's a man of great feeling. Something just hit him at this point. We've heard similar words, all of us who read the gospel. We've all read this essay by Eberhard before. It's something about that moment just made us all reel back and think, are we really doing this amongst ourselves? Are we reaching the people who need the reaching, and are they reaching us? And Richard Scott, the pastor, was also listening, and a few meetings later he came back with a pretty groundbreaking suggestion. Why doesn't Dwayne come back from his school of special needs and become a teacher here on the premises? And what if the young men of the community are interested in possibly signing up to become his students? And that was revolutionary in the extreme, but believe it or not, it happened in a most amazing way. And over the next, 14 years, the young men stepped up and offered their services, and it was just an unbelievable turn of events for our family. So if you're ready to be Dwayne's student, your crash course includes pushing him on a tricycle for hours on end, massaging his thin legs to relieve muscle cramps, trying to make sure there's more oatmeal going to his mouth and onto his shirt. A lot of really hefty skills going on here. And it also includes finding out that nothing you've excelled at up till now counts, right? If you're the best tackle in the field, meaningless, he needs help turning over in bed. If you're a straight A student, scholarship in the mail, well, this guy never graduated from kindergarten. If you're a sociable person, you're a people person, you life of the party, well, you're gonna have to deal with some one-way conversations for quite a while now. And the real kicker is standing by him through a seizure, which can go on for minutes at a time, and there's literally nothing you could do except stand there, make sure he's safe distance away from any hard surface. You stroked his shoulder to let him know you were there. And there was no off button. There's no way that you could conquer this situation. You could just only be there and stand by him. And then after he finished the seizure, he would sleep for a couple hours. And so your next assignment is just dealing with silence, right? And just sitting there by the side of somebody who doesn't need anything else but a companion. And at least for me, when that time rolled around in my life, it taught me this important lesson that just life isn't just a continuous party with witticisms flying and background music. You just also have to have this quiet time to just weep for lost chances, for lost time. Just let God speak into the silence that shows you what His will is for your life. And for me, I was very good at noise. And plenty of the young men who stepped up to help out with Dwayne were excellent at noise making. And this was just when we spoke to them afterwards, and they still come and connect with my parents. It's one of the best lessons they testify to. I learned how to be quiet, learned how to listen, and which is, if you think about it, how hard is that to accomplish in our culture today? And Dwayne could take people there, and he just shredded a lot of these myths these self-help myths that we subscribe to often without realizing it. You know, get ahead. Don't commit yourself, watch your back, and they all seem necessary, but they bring you down under this burden of self-protection where there's no room for obligation or for care or for love. So now dozens of young men had a chance to change that logic, and so our household expanded, and 2 young men at a time moved into our family apartment. My brothers and I by this time were in and out of the house. We were going to college, we were volunteering, different places around the world, but every time we came home, there was this one solid dude who knew the ropes, and he was teaching a junior varsity teammate, how to do the basic care. And there were doctors who taught each of them. There were therapists who did the therapy still. But these young men came around to the fact that what was needed here is love, patience, and some muscles because the guy was big, but primarily love. And when else do you get a chance like that at age 22? And Dwayne's care was physically and mentally demanding. You could never park him an inch too close to any hard surface. You had to set his brakes, you had to have him strapped in. Transfers from bed to chair, you needed to have mind and muscle completely ready. Sometimes you needed 2 guys. But boy, talk about fatherhood training. These guys could face anything that came along with humor and grace, and they could deal with basic nursing, daunting diapers, strings of sleepless nights, and leadership and humility and prayer when nothing else worked, and a lot of future families were to benefit. Now, like I mentioned before, these weren't the only people taking care of him. He had a phenomenal doctors team they were doctors who were part of our church community, so they knew him from babyhood, and 2 of them in particular had stood him by through a whole bunch of surgeries over the course of the years, each one trying to tame down the seizures in a different way, and each of them helped a little bit, and none of them were this miraculous cure that we were hoping for. But they'd seen him through thick and thin, and they just loved him like a son through just the good, the bad, and the really, really wretched days. And so Dr. Zimmerman, if he looked over at doing it during a church service and he didn't like his color, he was going to be there with a stethoscope afterwards, and he wasn't going to leave till we worked things out. So we had this really loyal team of adopted brothers and doctors at the same time, and my parents are still very much a part of the equation, but they were in their 60s. by that point. So they were house parents, they were young men coaches, and they weighed in with guidance before or after situations arose. But they got an 8-hour night after 18 years, and they got just to be. It was a beautiful thing to see. I couldn't quite believe the transformation that happened, and they were able to travel also internationally and just weigh in with the home team. It was just a new chapter in our family's life that I still can't believe happened. Still, when Dwayne turned 30, none of us would have guessed that he was on his home stretch of his life. I mean, he outlived I don't know how many specialist predictions, but at the same time, his friend Richard was dying of cancer in that year, 2011. And this was the pastor who had started off this whole chain of events. And I'll never forget Richard once calling our family into his house when he was, I mean, maybe 2 months away from dying. And I didn't know if it was his upcoming death that made him think just so clearly about Dwayne, his good friend. But I'll never forget what he said to us. He looked us in the eye and he said, when it's Dwayne's time to go home, let him go home. You know and I know he's going to get the best medical care in the world, but don't hold him back when it's his time to go. And because this is a man that had walked beside us now for 12 years, we knew how much he loved Dwayne. That was a precious thing to hear. It's something that we knew in our own hearts, but for somebody else to verbalize and walk with us on that path was precious beyond description. But for Dwayne, after Richard died that February, and Dwayne had this one more beautiful summer, just chilling by the lake, burgers and a beer, friends dropping in. Alumni from his school came by now with their families in tow. They wanted to introduce their children to their teacher. And that's a great thing to see over the course of 14 years. And fireworks, which are scheduled quite frequently, especially on his birthday, June 1st, by friends who knew what he appreciated. But toward the end of summer, something changed in his eyes, something changed in his quietness and his way of being. And his doctors had been keeping tabs on him all along, and they realized that after 30 more years than his doctors and his specialists in Albany had ever predicted, his life was coming to his end. His body was failing on a number of different fronts. And we had a huddle with them. We had to pray and grapple about it. What's best for this young man that we've treasured for so many years and thought we'd get. And we remembered Richard's words and came up with a plan that was just palliative care. It took care of comfort, made sure he was not in any pain. He always had all the food, his favorite meals that he wanted. Sometimes he just was like no food kind of response, but we always tried. And he had his beautiful big picture window, and the nearby kindergarten class would come bursting in any time of the day with raucous singing, which he thought was hilarious. But otherwise, he often didn't respond too much. And his medical crew, Dr. Zinman would come 2 or 3 times a day, and last thing at night. And more often than not, would just say a prayer, put on a stethoscope, just be. Together with my brother and our family, we like to just sing folk songs when it's bed. And so that cold autumn, when he was mostly in his bed, was very golden time for our family. I'm not going to forget them in a hurry. But often if you talk with them, like if I call his name, he would just look past me, and then he'd pull his gaze back. Like it's really hard to look at someone 2 feet away after you're looking very far, perhaps into eternity. And so his final days kind of snuck up on us. In November, then my brother Gareth was just sitting there holding his hand when he just quietly died. Gareth couldn't even tell what minute he left. But it was so amazing because his eyes had been sort of distant all day, but they were very clear in those last minutes. And he had a smile on his face. We hadn't seen a smile in days. And so that, just standing there and marveling, 31 years when you got told it was just going to be one, and when so many people had asked you why even one, you couldn't have articulated it, but if I could have, there's a lot I could have said. And there, on the day of his funeral, we stood around his open casket, just typical how our family always gathered. He was the hub and we were the spokes, and we just marveled at 31 years of intense living that he packed in, and the circle of friends that had just become so wide. And of course, all his friends came from near and far, everybody who'd ever taken care of him. It taught me so much about what is a person's value in life. Who sets a value in somebody's life and what they can teach each of us. you know, if his purpose in life is just to crack a cold heart and to train it in service, isn't that the best gift any person can do for another person? That kind of gift doesn't show up on an ultrasound. It just doesn't, it's not mentioned in that first diagnosis of disability, and it's not measured by tests, and it's not included in any discussion about euthanasia. And to me, that's why Dwayne's story is more than just a tale of a great kid that landed up in a neat community and a caring family. And it's more than just a testament to the concept that all lives have value. There's people living bravely with disabilities everywhere, and some of them have great networks of care, and some of them are alone, but are the people who pass them by any less alone necessarily? Perhaps this isolation from humanity that is so cleverly discussed in books like Practical Ethics is just, it's so distant that it's sort of a clinical coldness that it can suggest the ending of suffering by ending the life of the person who suffers. And is it possible, or even do we want to protect ourselves from suffering with these kind of decisions? And if it's possible to protect ourselves from grief and from suffering, are we protecting ourselves from love? So I would just, if I would get to meet Peter Singer now, and I would like to meet him one day, I would just ask him, can you come along, can you walk alongside a family like this, you know, and just see if you're willing to have these practical ethics, if that's the name of your book, and really not theoretical ethics, but practical. Are you willing to walk alongside somebody and accept some ethics that are distributed in the reverse direction? And 72 young men experience that truth, which this utilitarian project rejects as an outmoded relic, right? And these students thank Dwayne, who's really my brother and theirs, for turning their idea of success on its head. So, to me, that's just the meaning of his life, and I did have an auto-visual. Here's Dwayne, he's laughing at fireworks. That was my brother in a nutshell, and is this somebody who should have been spared the suffering of existence? And that's the note I'd like to end on today.
Yes.
From what I understand, Peter Singer doesn't live up to his ideal. I don't know much about it, but I've heard he has a mother with Alzheimer's disease who fits perfectly into the non-person, and he's very caring and loving and takes care of her, even though she's exactly what he talks about, a non-person. So he doesn't walk the walk when it comes
That's so
to
wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
Well, I think he did acknowledge that and talk about that as having been something that has challenged his own philosophical thinking. I don't know if she's still alive. I remember a few years ago he was writing about this as a challenge to his thinking, but you probably know more.
Not necessarily, but I just think, who wants to live in a world where nobody needs anybody else? You know, I mean, it's precisely others needing us that keeps us human, for God's sake. You know, I mean, Mother Teresa told a story about how she came across a family that had a profoundly disabled child, and they named the child Professor of Love because this child taught him how to love. I mean, and the fact that they referred to your brother as teacher is the same thing.
And they do, and they call themselves alumni, you know, and they'll still treat my parents like parents all these years later. I do have time for just one more quick quote. I just was noticing at the end, because I was sitting there reading Peter Singer, and I had this battered old ring binder of my parents' letters as sustenance when this was getting a bit tough. And I realized that they actually answered each other beautifully. And so there was this one quote where Peter Singer said, "The main point is clear. Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often it's not wrong at all." And then it was answered, to my mind, by this young man, Roel Clement, who responded, "Dwayne has accomplished more in his life than most of us ever will," this is a letter to my parents, "simply by being weak and allowing God to work through him." And I did want to say that Roel now is a father of 4 sons, twin 8-year-olds, 5-year-old, and 3-year-old, same age as my daughter, Robert, who has cerebral palsy. And so the story goes on, and he teaches and he deals with Robert in the same way that he learned love and compassion, and teaching station of my brother doing. And if this is the model that we can sustain, if these are the teachers that we can listen to, that's what the next generation will pass on to their up-and-coming teachers.
I just, some of the things you were talking about when you were talking about the assisted suicide and euthanasia, because I've been reading about that for several years, and what is interesting is that because of how far it's gone in places like the Netherlands, there's been a huge, right, you know that, it's been a huge kind of, not huge, but it is, I think, having an effect on how some of that is perceived even here by people who would temperamentally be, would think that that was something that would be a way of letting people have control and dignity and be in favor of that. But in a place like the Netherlands, where they've taken it really quite far with what they've allowed, people who they've allowed to die, including people under the age of 18. They now allow children, 18 to 12 or 14, you can...
There's an age limit.
Yeah, and so they have had at least one child who was this, and that seemed to be a little bit of a throwing down of a gauntlet for people that I've read who had said, this actually does give me pause because I've never believed the slippery slope argument, but actually, here it is.
Well, one other thing, I'll just respond to that right away,
Yeah.
is a lot of the defenders of assisted suicide in this country will point to Oregon. It's had it in place now for 20 years or so. Say, oh, none of these dangers and horrors that everybody keeps saying about assisted suicide have happened there. It's not expanded to those beyond terminal illness, and we haven't had situations of people being sort of forced into this or coerced into it. Well, we do have anecdotes of people being forced into it, coerced into it. We have anecdotes of people who were not offered life-saving care, but were offered assisted suicide. Okay. One of the problems is the reporting systems that they set up for this are set up not to reveal those things, but to conceal those things. Nobody has to be present at the time in which this was taken, the drugs were taken. In most cases, one of the witnesses to the request for the drug, for lethal drugs, can be an heir. And the other person who has to witness could be a friend of the heir. But any of these so-called safeguards that they talk about on assisted suicide all occur before the prescription of the lethal drugs. And after that, there's no idea when this is actually taken. There's no requirement that there be any witnesses there. So if you're somebody who wants to gently or overtly coerce somebody into this, it's very easily done. And in the end, nobody knows about it. And by the way, most of the laws that have this in place require the coroner or the person who signs the death certificate to lie. They have to say that it wasn't assisted suicide that caused the death, it was the underlying disease that caused the death. So, they talk about the no abuses and such. Well, we know that there are some from anecdotes, but the reason we maybe don't know more is because of the reporting system and the way it is. And so, yeah, it's a very big problem. And I think the other notion about, they haven't expanded it beyond terminally ill, which, by the way, the whole definition of terminal illness is meaningless. Any physician will tell you predicting 6 months of life remaining is very difficult for even the experts to predict. And the definition of terminal illness in most of these states is something broader than most people would realize. It means dying within 6 months with or without treatment. So a person with diabetes is technically terminally ill under that definition. It's much broader than the person with terminal cancer who's had 6 months in and they're going to face unimaginable suffering or whatever. The people who do this that list the reasons for why they do it. Pain or fear of pain is one of the last things that's even listed.
I think being a burden.
Being a burden is very high.
And I know, because I think it was a Canadian study that came out that was talking about when they interviewed people and pain was very low, and the highest was fear of being dependent on others or being a burden to family or friends. And I know also, at least in overseas, it's not even a terminal disease. A lot of people who are committing suicide are people with mental health issues, long-standing depression. And then you come into a thing like, well, you know, has this person actually had access to good care? Now there are people who, and I was talking about this with the end of life and beginning of life issues. To me, they're very particularly hard, of course, because one has sympathy for the people involved. So I have seen one has sympathy for a teenage girl who's pregnant. One has sympathy for someone who is facing a very painful death. And so these are hard issues, and they're often hard, which is why, anyway, they're particularly hard issues, I think. Even if I take one position, I sympathize often with some of the other people who go through this. But I think with assisted suicide, a lot of it is coming down to, again, those issues of lack of care or access to the health stuff that you were talking about before. You know, do they have good mental health care? How is it a 12-year-old, 14-year-old can be allowed to commit suicide? You know, at that point, what are the other alternatives or other kinds of care? It becomes a very
Christian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a quick question. When you were talking about the difference between, I wrote it down, it was reasonable care of benefit versus reasonable care of recovery. I want to know if that is rooted in Catholic social teachings. I know, like, especially in the Charlie Gard case, or in other cases where people will say, like, well, why waste our resources, you know, on these people where they won't get any better, they won't be cured. How do we, like, is that kind of viewed as, like, no, because from what I understand in the Charlie Gard case, the parents knew that it wouldn't cure the illness completely, but it would give some kind of possible benefit. Can we use that as saying, like, we are helping people in that when we do use medical care, rather than kind of describing the utilitarian
Well,
view?
in terms of your first point, reasonable hope of benefit versus reasonable hope of recovery. It goes back to, you mentioned Catholic social teaching, but Catholic bioethical teaching has, up until I would say maybe the 90s or early 2000s, there wasn't a clear understanding as to when you remove nutrition and hydration. And there was a good idea as to when to do that, but there wasn't anything that was all very definitive. St. John Paul II had wrote a document to a group, and he had mentioned, he was talking about nutrition and hydration, and he had made a very definitive statement that it's always, nutrition and hydration is always ordinary care. It's not treatment. In principle. It's not treatment where you can make a case for ordinary, extraordinary or what have you. There was a group of Jesuits that didn't agree with that, and a lot of their writings had pointed to reasonable hope of recovery, which is simply wrong, because it doesn't fit with any of the teaching. And so reasonable hope of recovery says, well, I can remove this food and water because you're never going to recover, and so therefore it's not necessary. It's useless. But that's not the point. Nutrition and hydration is going to give you sustenance, just like warmth and being bathed and all that kind of stuff. It's going to give you those needs that every human has. So it's not treatment, it's care. And so now we have to battle on that end. Because benefit is different than recovery. You may never recover, but you could always benefit. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Basic care versus medical treatment.
Yeah.
Quickly, that includes stomach tubes.
That would include nasal tubes, it would include stomach tubes. you know,
There can certainly be cases where even the provision of nutrition and hydration would be extraordinary.
right.
That's why in principle it's ordinary care. But if the delivery of it in these cases oftentimes can lead to infections or intestinal blockages and other kinds of things that can complicate it and create burdens that then make it optional to continue. Or certainly as a person gets close to death, the body begins to shut down and they're not even processing food. Well, then to continue to pump food and fluids into their body would be useless and it would be burdensome.
Right.
So, but when the person is otherwise benefiting from nutrition hydration, it's basic care,
Right.
whether they can do it orally or not. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So we have to find a different way to approach these things